Hey, Austin here. I wanted to take a little bit of time before this video begins and talk a little bit about what Bible Unbound is and what the heart behind it is. The mission of Bible Unbound is to discover the Bible by uncovering the gospel in every biblical story. That's so that you have the right tools necessary to read the Bible well. And so we aren't trying to make it G-rated in order to fit some sort of audience agenda, and nor are we trying to make it fit some sort of social political agenda. We are trying to introduce you to the Bible on the Bible's terms. Said another way, we are trying to show you how the original audience, the early church, might have read some of these stories. And so with that said, we are not trying to accentuate uncomfortable parts of the Bible, but this story does contain some of that. And that's just because that's a part of the biblical epic. And so if you find yourself uncomfortable or questioning or wrestling with any of the pieces of content throughout this video, I highly recommend that you go and you talk to your pastor, or you go and consult your nearest Bible. Secondly, if you've been around Bible Unbound for any period of time and you've been impacted or you've learned something from the videos, then I would encourage you to check out our Patreon channel at patreon.com/BibleUnbound. Patreon is a place where you get a bunch of people to donate little amounts of money to fund a mission. The mission, of course, being to discover the Bible by uncovering the gospel. And so if that's something you're passionate about, if that's something you'd like to see happen, go and visit us on patreon.com. But until then, we'll see you next time. Let's explore. God led the people of Israel out of Egypt by a pillar of fire at night, and by day the Lord appeared to them as a pillar of cloud. And the people followed God wherever he went. And soon the people came to Pi-hahiroth, nearly a day's journey away. In front of them was the vast Red Sea, but behind them the army of Pharaoh quickly approached. So Moses got up, and he said to the people, "Fear not, stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent." And the pillar of God moved between the people of God and the Egyptians as Moses raised his staff high into the air. Suddenly, a strong west wind made the sea a dry land, and the chaotic waters of uncreation stood up on either end as a wall, divided for the people to pass safely through. The people of God looked out over the deliverance that God had won for them. They looked out and saw a God who had complete control over the land and the sea. They saw their God who overthrew the Egyptian pantheon as though without even trying, and he was the king of all creation in that moment. He had control over all of the nations. And the people of God looked out, and they had an answer in their yearning hearts to their profoundly simple question. He is the God who saves. You see, Moses was 80 years old when God brought Israel out of Egypt. And he had been asking this question all his life, a question that we all wrestle with, I think. Who is God? But now, along with all of Israel, he needed to ask a much deeper question, a much more difficult question. Why would God save me? This is the story of Moses, the man of God. Though the Israelites stand on the far side of the shore that day, singing a song of God's salvation, this is only the beginning. The second they turn their backs on this miraculous power, they forget the answer to the profoundly simple question, and they begin to ask a new one. Why would God save us? Like the first question, this one too can change depending on how you ask it. Some people actually want to know the function of why God would save a sinful people. What purpose is that? Others want to know how it's possible that God would ever save someone so sinful. This is when we find Israel heading toward Sinai. Now, it's true, a lot happens in the 3 months while Israel is in the wilderness of Elim. It's from Exodus 16 until 19. When they leave the Red Sea and they begin to follow God for the first time. And I think all of that stuff is crucial, vitally important and exciting, but it would be best explored in the next Moses video. For now, we meet the congregation of Israel at the foot of Mount Sinai, where all creation is coming together to meet God. Take a moment and think about what it would be like to come into direct contact with the sun. Sunglasses just aren't going to do it. And God knows this. In the same way that people aren't designed to land on the sun, people are not designed to be in God's full, unadulterated presence while sinful and fallen. They would just die immediately. And so, like the gods from the surrounding nations, God descends onto the top of a tall mountain, a safe distance away from the people of Israel. And God calls Moses up to himself on Mount Sinai. And when Moses gets up to God, he speaks to Moses like a friend. God says, "You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Therefore, you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Moses then has to descend back down the mountain and tell Israel all that the Lord plans for them. That God plans to prosper them into this bountiful, beautiful nation because of his great salvation. Israel is supposed to respond to this miraculous salvation out of thankfulness and reverence to their God and King. God even tells them how they can do this. They are to obey his voice and to keep his covenant. After all, the assumption here is that God's life-giving voice and his just covenantal laws are designed to lead people into his presence and flourish out into the world. It really is a win-win for Israel, salvation and flourishing under the just protection of God as their king. So it's really no surprise that when Moses tells them all of this, the people eagerly accept the Lord's partnership. And so Moses then has to go back up the mountain and relay all of this information to God. You know, if you've ever climbed a mountain or even just like a big hill, you can begin to see the problem here. Moses then has to go back down to the people, and he tells them all that they need to do to get ready to meet God. He's not going to stay up on the mountain, Moses says, high away from the people forever. 3 days pass before the people come face to face with the sun. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God. And they took their stand the foot of the mountain. The Lord of heaven and earth, the God of all creation, breaks through time and space, matter and spirit, and descends onto Mount Sinai. Here, Moses then goes back up, while the people wait at the base. God tells Moses that no one should come up the mountain or else they might die. However, it would be best for Aaron to meet God here too. But before Moses can leave and go and get Aaron, God begins to give Moses the foundation of human morality, the Ten Commandments. In fact, the Ten Commandments are so foundational to the human experience that the rest of the laws given throughout the Old Testament are just variations and explanations of these 10 laws. All of them are designed so that the people of God can flourish in God's unhindered presence to them. It's like Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. In fact, God seems to have a garden in mind for them. He tells Moses of this land that has become so violent, so drenched in blood and injustice, that God's not going to stand for it any longer. Little by little, he says, I will drive them out from before you until you have increased and possessed the land. And I will set your border from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, and from the wilderness to the Euphrates. For I will give the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you shall drive them out from before you. After all of this, after Moses receives the 10 Commandments, after Moses is told that Israel is no longer a slave to the nations, but is God's people, after Moses is told that Israel is a royal priesthood, God asks Moses to go and gather a bunch of the leaders from Israel and to share a meal with him. And then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel. There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. And he did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God, and ate and drank. During this feast, God calls Moses to come up just a little higher, and so Moses takes with him Joshua to stand at a distance. Presumably, the elders go back down. God wants this to be a regular practice for all the people of Israel to eat and to drink in his presence. And so God gives Moses instructions of building God a house. God is going to come down off of the mountain and live among the people. God has everything in place. Indeed, the people only need to be still and know that he is God and is on their side. In fact, he has even raised builders among the congregation. He has set up laws to bring the people into his presence. And after all of this, reveals to Moses that even time itself has been set up so that the people can enjoy God, so that they can rest, they can sacrifice. You see, it's as though after the land and after the people have become consecrated, God commands that the Sabbath, or time itself, be set apart and made holy. It would seem that the divine presence of God is growing a flourishing garden in the midst of Israel. And if Israel were to follow all of the laws laid out here, they would be the most just nation in all of history. They would be the most fruitful people in the world. They would be the happiest, most abundant of all nations. They would never need to worry about anything if they trusted that God was who he said he was. But when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together into Aaron, and they said to him, "Up! Make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what's become of him." And so Aaron said to them, "Oh, take off the rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives and of your sons and your daughters, and bring them to me." And so all the people, they took off the rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool, and he made a golden calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." Well, God tells Moses that this is happening. And Moses, infuriated and confused, no doubt, begins to plead with God that he not destroy them. You see, Moses sees the reality that God has set up for Israel in his covenant. Plus, it would be hard to believe that Moses doesn't realize that his brother, his wife, probably his sister, are all partaking in this idolatrous adultery. And so Moses goes out of the presence of God, and he meets Joshua, who has heard this commotion, but he can't quite make out what it is. As soon as Moses came near to the camp and saw the golden calf and the dancing, Moses' anger burned hot. He threw the tablets out of his hand and broke them at the foot of the mountain. He took the calf that they had made and burned it with fire and ground it to a powder and scattered it on the water and made the people of Israel drink it. Then Aaron said, "Let not the anger of my Lord burn hot. You know the people, that they are set on evil. For they said to me, 'Make us gods who shall go before us.' As for this Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what was become of him." And so I said to them, "Let any who have gold take it off." And so they gave it to me, and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf. This ridiculous tale, of course, is the exact same way in which Adam reacted to God: blame and pity. So Moses implores the people of God that whoever actually wants to be on God's side should gather around him. And he splits the camp in half, and the Levites, they all stand near him. Then, in a reflection of Babel, the people's pride crumbles under the weight of God's glory and justice. And 3,000 people died that day in Israel by the sword. It will take a lot more than the promise of justice and righteousness to ensure that Israel is not like the surrounding nations. So God commands the people that they move away from Sinai and toward the land that he has promised them, Canaan. While the people are traveling in the wilderness, Moses asks to see God's glory. And the Lord, somewhat surprisingly, agrees with his friend and tells Moses that he will have all of his goodness pass before Moses in the cleft of a rock. But in order to do that first, Moses needs to remake the tablets of stone with the 10 Commandments. After he does this, Moses goes up onto a mountain, and the glory of God, all of his goodness, passes before him, and the Lord proclaims, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and of the children's children to the 3rd and 4th generation. Moses then worships God here and asks him to forgive Israel for their idolatry. What we see here is incredibly important, and so I don't want you to miss it. We see that even though God has miraculously saved Israel and promised them nothing but goodness, the people of God are going to need an intercessor who will bring the people of God into the presence of God. And that is exactly why the role of priest is being defined in Moses here. It's a person who will bring the people of God into the presence of God. So it should come as no surprise that God tells Moses here that he has forgiven Israel, because he is going to perform miracles in Israel that no one could even conceive of. But what salvation could possibly be greater than the one experienced at the Red Sea? Well, we aren't told yet. But God renews his covenant with the people of Israel. Somehow, they are going to play into this magnificent miracle promised to humanity. So Moses goes back down from seeing God's glory, his face shining. The people put a veil over his face because of that. Then Moses reminds them of some important and specific laws. And it is here, after all of that, that the construction of God's temple palace begins at the hands of Aholiab and Bezalel. The magnificent temple palace should recall the temples that Pharaoh made Israel build. Large, imposing, stationary. Except it wasn't anything like that. God has Israel build a rather small-sized tent, furnished quite sparingly, reflecting nature and gardens. By all accounts, it was quite odd. But perhaps the weirdest part of it all was that the people of Israel, unlike the surrounding nations, really truly believed that the actual presence of God now dwelt among them. Before the tent was fully finished, Moses used to take the tent and pitch it outside the camp, far off from the camp, and he called it the tent of meeting. And everyone who sought the Lord would go out to the tent of meeting, which was outside the camp. Whenever Moses went out to the tent, all the people would rise up, and each would stand at his tent door and would watch Moses until he had gone into the tent. When Moses entered the tent, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent. And the Lord would speak with Moses. And when all the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance of the tent, all the people would rise up and worship, each at his tent door. Thus, the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face, as a man speaks to his friend. And when Moses turned again into the camp, his assistant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, would not depart from the tent. Finally, when the tent of meeting was finished down to the last detail, the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. This is really the striking conclusion to Moses as the priest of God. After all, how is Moses supposed to intercede on behalf of Israel if he can't enter into God's presence? Moses will need to hand the role off to somebody else. Theoretically, Aaron. But then, once Aaron dies, someone else will need to intercede, and then someone else, and then someone else. And this can't go on forever. Israel is going to need a perfect, eternal intercessor. But once this is done, Aaron will then be able to help bring the people of God into the presence of God and intercede on behalf of Israel. Therefore, the priest needs to know how to atone for the sins of the entire nation. And then if a leader needs to enter into God's presence, or a lay person needs to enter into God's presence, Moses is given instructions for how to do that as well. All of which end with them eating a meal together in the presence of God. The land to which God is bringing the people has become so desecrated by injustice that God hears the cry of blood from the ground. Soon, like Cain, God is going to wipe the slate clean and throw them out. You see, the Canaanites have been busy sacrificing their own children, hating each other. They worship anything that moves unless it's the God of truth. So God commands Israel, "You shall be holy, for I am holy." You see, they are to be physically clean because God does not separate the physical and the spiritual. This is when and why ritual water cleansing becomes a core part of Israelite identity. Israel is not going to be like the Pharaoh they've come from or the Canaan they're going to. So in order to atone for their sins, God commands they be physically clean. They can't touch dead things. They can't touch blood or excrement and a host of other unnameable things. This required an immense amount of trust in a God who has control over all of creation, mind you. A lot of the things that would make Israel unclean under the Levitical law are things that you would either come into contact with from a hard day's work on the farm or by diseases that you have absolutely no control over, or even just by living life. But they will be holy. This, after all, is the meaning of holy, set apart. And God means this. They will be holy because God is holy. So if they find themselves unable to enter into God's presence and offer a sin offering, God is going to make a way for them. For now, God provides the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur, where a priest atones for the sins of the entire nation of Israel. But this can't go on forever. You see, a priest should take 2 unblemished rams. One is to be killed, but the other is to be set free in the wilderness, bearing the sins of the congregation of Israel. Like being delivered from the bondage of slavery in Egypt, this deliverance from the bondage of sin is an amazing miracle. The people of Israel are meant to respond out of thankfulness and reverence by holding a long feast and many festivals. In fact, the Israelite year is supposed to be filled with these parties. 7 festivals are held throughout the year to mark the months. This creates a nation built on God's rest, built on trusting in their God. God's people are supposed to be built upon a foundation of justice. There will be no slavery, no relational death, and God will dwell among them. This is why you are saved, to dwell with God and flourish as human beings. Jesus provides the perfect picture of this. As for why God would save you, well, it doesn't seem like you get much say in a reality where God wants to be with you and not the other way around. In other words, God saves people as unjust and sinful as you and the Israelites and I because it gives him great joy to dwell with his people and partner with them to bring heaven to earth. Presumably, Moses then begins this bright new future by atoning for the sins of Israel and handing the reins off to Aaron. And Aaron is going to mediate the presence of God to the people of God. But Moses' story is far from over. For here, God calls to Moses from inside the tent of meeting, and he tells Moses that the people of Israel are about to go to war. Hey, Austin here. Just a quick reminder about Bible Unbound and the content you just watched, which was supported by our funders over on patreon.com. Patreon is where you try to get a bunch of people to donate small amounts to fund a mission. And the mission of Bible Unbound is to discover the Bible by uncovering the gospel. You see, we are passionate about creating a community of people who want to see Bible-curious people understand the Bible by seeing the gospel and Jesus proclaimed throughout the entire thing. And so if you want to fund that mission, if you want to become a part of the vision we have over here at Bible Unbound, you can explore more of that over on patreon.com. We'd love to see you there. Thanks so much.